Hi, everyone. Welcome back to part 4 of our read aloud of the graduation of Jake Moon. When we left off from part 3, things just haven't been real great for Jake and his family. They're struggling with Skelly's Alzheimer's disease. Skelly had that accident falling down the stairs and broke both of his wrists. His forgetfulness and his ability to speak properly and make good decisions is worsening. He's like Jake said when he was playing baseball, he just kind of wandered off into the middle of the field during a game. So things are just not easy for Jake and his family right now, and we'll pick up there with things kind of still being a struggle. By the time 6th grade rolled around in September, the laying low strategy had turned into total boredom, and I was desperate to get out of the house again. 6th grade started off pretty good for me too. Like the second week of school, my teacher asked me if I'd run for class treasurer. And just a day or two after that, we got this new kid in our class named Aaron Fryer, who was assigned to the seat right next to me, which was so lucky I couldn't believe it. Because you could tell by the way Aaron looked and dressed and walked even, that he was going to be seriously popular. As soon as he sat down, a plan was already forming in my head. I would make friends with Aaron while he was still desperate for friends, and then shoot straight up the popularity ladder with him. The second week he was in school, I got the nerve to invite him to spend the night at my house. It had been more than a year since anyone had slept over. With all the problems going on with my grandfather, I hardly even thought about stuff like that, in fact. But even though it was risky having someone in my house with Skelly acting so weird, the opportunity with Aaron was too good to pass up. And besides, if Aaron and I mostly stayed in my room, and Skelly mostly slept in his chair, there was a decent chance the two of them wouldn't even have to meet. I planned out the night like you wouldn't believe. First, in a covert operation at school, I got a hold of the latest teenage slasher movie, which Maud refused to let me rent. Then I drilled it into her head that she was not, under any circumstances, allowed to open my door without knocking first. And even then she had to wait for me to say, "Come in." That way I'd have more than enough time to click off the DVD player. So no problem. I also told her that she was not allowed to let Skelly out of her sight, which she already knew, she said, but just to be sure, I kept on mentioning it right up until Aaron's parents dropped him off at my house on Friday. As soon as he knocked on the door that night, I whisked him straight to my room. Then I shut the door and opened a brand new video game I had bought with my allowance. An hour or so later, my mother kept her word and kicked the door about 10 times with her foot before carrying in a big bucket of chicken for us to eat in the room. Aaron was having a good time too, you could tell he was. And the movie? Well, that was only gonna make things better. Or at least that's what I thought. But as the two of us were finishing our chicken, there was another noise at my door. It was Ma bringing dessert, I figured, so I didn't pay much attention. But when the door opened, it wasn't my mother at all. It was guess who? Skelly had been on his way to the shower and had heard our voices, so he wandered on in and stood in the middle of my room. And he wasn't wearing pants. No pants at all, I mean. No long pants, no short pants, no underpants. And Aaron Fryer bust out laughing so hard that orange soda came out his nose. He didn't stop either, not even when Ma ran in apologizing all over the place and rushed Skelly back out the door. Not even when I explained to him about the Alzheimer's or swore that Skelly had never done anything like that before. I begged him not to say anything. "Come on, Aaron, please don't tell anybody at school, okay? I mean, what if this was your grandfather? What if he had an incurable brain disease? You wouldn't want people cracking jokes about him, would you?" I never should have used the word crack, because Aaron busted out laughing all over again. Now I was getting mad. "Okay, knock it off, Aaron, I mean it. How can you laugh at someone who's sick like that? It's only going to get worse, too. He's going to die from it, okay? How is that funny to you?" Aaron stopped laughing then. He was sorry, he said. He hadn't known Skelly was going to die. He got it now. He told me and he swore. He'd never mention what happened to anyone. He swore. But on Monday morning, I walked past a group of guys on the playground, and a kid I hardly knew cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Hey, Moon, hear your grandpa's a perv." It's been 2.5 years since Aaron Fryer spent the night. No kid's been invited to my house since. I dropped out of the race for class treasurer. My mother begged me not to, but I knew it would be asking for trouble. Dirty campaigns are a fact of life, and there are just too many words that rhyme with perv. Later that month, I decided not to go out for cross country. And in October, I stayed home from basketball tryouts. By then, Ma was going nuts practically, swearing up and down that we could still make it all work. But I'm not one of those kids who can brush off humiliation like it's a crumb on my shirt. And the idea that Skelly would be sitting in the stands in my school gym during a basketball game made me crazy almost. The word no gets easier the more you say it. And as the year went on, I got better and better at making up excuses and turning down invitations. The logic was as simple as my new life. If I didn't go to anyone's house, no one would expect to come to mine. It takes a while for friends to stop calling, but eventually they do. The house stays quieter when the phone doesn't ring. It's depressing at first, but if no one calls, at least your grandfather can't pick up the phone while he's watching Wheel of Fortune and tell Lucas Carney that he'd like to buy a vowel. The night that happened, Lucas laughed about it, but I could tell from his voice that it had creeped him out again. And before he hung up, he asked if from now on I could answer the phone before Skelly did. It bothered me that he would even ask that. I said I'd try, but trying must not have been good enough because Lucas didn't call me anymore after that. And so what had started out as a perfectly good school year had turned out totally rotten by Christmas. But just to show you how weird life can be, though, on the first day back from winter break, something came up that almost turned everything around. It was almost time for the afternoon bell to ring when my teacher started handing out permission slips for music lessons. As usual, I began passing the whole stack to the kid behind me without bothering to take one, but then out of nowhere it hit me. Music lessons. The drums! I could take drum lessons. It was perfect. Everything about drum lessons would fit into my life. Since I was still watching Skelly after school, I had tons of time to practice. Plus, I'd be learning a valuable skill. Plus, Mom wouldn't have to drag Skelly out in public to watch me. Plus, playing the drums was just plain cool. As soon as I got home that day, I called Ma at the office. I was breathless almost trying to get it all out. The lessons are on Monday and Thursday afternoons, but they're only for an hour, Ma. So I was thinking that maybe Lana could stay extra for just those 2 days. Please, Ma, just figure out a way for me to take these lessons and I'll never ask you for another thing. I swear. I promise I swear. The next morning, my mother offered to pay Lana twice her normal hourly salary for those 2 extra hours a week if she'd stay. And she even offered to send a cab for Vanna on the days of my drum lessons and bring her over to the house. When Lana said no, Mom offered the job to Etta Gerber across the street. When Etta Gerber said she was working full-time in a tropical fish store, Ma put an ad in the paper for a new nurse. By the first drum lesson, 6 people had called for interviews. By the second drum lesson, Ma had interviewed 2 of them, both cranky. By the third drum lesson, she'd interviewed the other 4, all too expensive. By the fourth drum lesson, I'd already missed 4 drum lessons. The music teacher said it was too late to catch up. My mother promised I could take drum lessons in the summer, but by the summer, I just didn't care anymore. It took over a year for me to completely accept it, but as hard as she had tried, my mother had not been able to hang on to normal. Even before the start of 7th grade, I had officially stopped thinking of myself as a regular kid and had begun thinking of myself as a kid with obligations at home. The first week of PE, when Coach Rob passed out slips to play on our 7th grade flag football league, I just wadded mine up and shot it into the trash can on my way out the gym. Never gave it another thought after that. I promise I didn't. But then on the day of the first practice game, I was walking across the playground on my way home from school, and this friend of mine on the team, a kid named Harris Riley, was tossing around a football, and he yelled at me to go out for a pass. So just for the heck of it, I did. I caught the ball and threw it back. Harris backed up and said, "Go long, Moon." I turned around and started to run downfield. The ball sailed in the air, up and out and over my head. I ran faster and faster, as fast as I could go. And at the very last minute, I reached my arms and stretched my fingers to their limit. The next thing I knew, I was traveling sideways through the air, like flying almost. And then smack! Just as I caught the ball, I hit the ground belly first and started rolling around and laughing so hard I couldn't stop. I mean, it just felt so good, you know? Running and laughing and diving into the grass like that. And more than anything, I wanted to stay and watch the game. I looked at my watch. I was already late. Lana was going to be mad. I took off running for home. In fact, I was almost out the school gate when this totally unexpected thought came breezing through my brain. So what? I stopped cold. No, really. So what if Lana was mad? Was the world going to come to an end? Would the earth explode if Lana didn't pick Vanna up at exactly 2:45? I'm telling you, the idea was so freeing I can't even describe it. I turned around, walked back to the sidelines, and sat down. 20 minutes later, I was still sitting there when Ma's car pulled into the parking lot. When she got out, she started walking that heavy-footed kind of walk that mothers do when they're so out of control they don't care who knows it. Skelly was a few feet behind her. I'm sure she told him to stay in the car, but he'd already forgotten. Even from the football field, I could see he had dressed himself again. He was wearing pajama bottoms with suspenders plus a wool scarf. I jumped up and ran and started running towards them. I prayed as I ran. Please, Ma. Oh, God, please, just don't start shouting. Not in front of all these kids. I was almost there when the explosion came. Where in God's name have you been, Jake? Her voice was loud and screechy, and it carried in the wind. I could feel the eyes of the entire football team staring at my back. Panicking, I brought my finger to my lips and made the shush sound to my mother. Big mistake. My mother's voice went up an entire octave. Oh, no, you don't! Do not try to shush me, mister. Do you have any idea the trouble you've caused? Do you? Do you? She lunged for my arm and then started marching me to the car. When she saw Skelly, she grabbed him too, and the three of us paraded across the grass like the jolly members of the Hey, Look at Us, We're Insane family. We drove home in silence. When we were almost there, Skelly looked over the seat at me and waved his fingers. Glared at him in his stupid striped pajamas with his idiotic brain disease. I hated him. Lana quit. She said Vanna got so upset when she wasn't picked up on time she tore up her binder and stomped on her lunchbox. Apparently Vanna's a freak. The timing of Lana's I quit call couldn't have been worse either. Ma had just cooled down from her tirade at school and was apologizing for going ballistic. It was just one of those days, she said. She was getting a cold and it had been a bad day at work, plus Skelly had been particularly stubborn all afternoon. She was trying to get me to say that I forgave her, which I hadn't yet, when Lana called. 5 minutes into the conversation, Ma laid the receiver down next to the phone and went to her room. Even with the door shut, I could hear her crying in there. I didn't go in, though. Sometimes when my mother gets real low like that, she needs to talk. Other times, she just needs to be alone. Lana gave Ma and Aunt Margaret 2 weeks to find another nurse. The next day, they started calling hospitals and nursing homes and any place that had a medical staff who worked with old people. Eventually, Ma called the Senior Citizen Center not far from our house, and Alma Russell answered the phone. Turned out to be one of those weird coincidences that happen in life sometimes. Or who knows, maybe it was fate. But as soon as my mother introduced herself, Mrs. Russell let out a whoop of surprise. She said that she and the lovely Mr. Skelly Moon had grown up on the very same street together. 2 hours later, Mrs. Russell called back and said she wanted the job. Just like Lana, Mrs. Russell was a registered nurse. She'd been working at the senior center for years and was used to dealing with Alzheimer's patients. Ma and Aunt Margaret checked out her background and hired her the same day as her interview. As a special added bonus, Mrs. Russell was single with no family of her own, so she could help out late at night and on weekends if we needed her. Looking back, I think that hiring Alma Russell was one of the best things that ever happened to my grandfather. I mean, it's true she turned out to have, well, a few quirks that we didn't count on, but no one could do a better job taking care of Skelly than she does. Ma says it's magical the way Mrs. Russell automatically knows what's bothering Skelly when no one else has a clue. Still, like I said, she is a little quirky, and getting used to her has taken some time. In fact, she's worked for us for almost a year and a half now, and there are still days I don't think I'm totally there yet. For one thing, there's no Mr. Russell, which wouldn't be that unusual, except that as far as anyone knows, there's never been a Mr. Russell. All Ma knows for sure is that in 1963, Miss Alma Schlossman flew to Las Vegas for a week. She came back calling herself Mrs. Alma Russell. That's all she came back with, too, the new name. No new husband, no new wedding pictures, no new anything else. We'll probably never get to the bottom of what really happened out there. My mother casually mentioned the city of Las Vegas to her while they were folding laundry once, and Mrs. Russell just picked up the basket, went out the back door, and finished folding in the yard. And also, just for the record, Alma Russell always dresses in a nurse's uniform. Like, always, I mean. Like, even on her days off, when she's mowing her lawn or washing her car, she wears a white dress, white shoes, and those white swishy nurse's stockings. Twice, when we've taken her to a nice restaurant for dinner, she's added a nurse's cap to dress things up. My mother calls Mrs. Russell a godsend. But if God sent us Mrs. Russell, I'm pretty sure she was meant to be a gag gift. Still, for as much as she gets on my nerves. I do owe Mrs. Russell a debt so big, I'll never be able to repay it. 'Cause see, it was Mrs. Russell who came to Skelly's rescue that terrible afternoon when I saw him in the school dumpster. It's funny how when you try not to think about something, you think about it all the more. The details are still clear in my mind. Like I still remember the mocking tone in both those kids' voices when they shouted their insults at Skelly. And how when they finally walked away, my grandfather kept waving till they turned the corner. Not long after that, one of the school custodians spotted him and went running over to help. He didn't yell at Skelly or anything, just motioned for him to get out. But my grandfather can be stubborn sometimes, and he didn't budge. I was still trying to force myself to go over and help when the custodian spotted Skelly's Medic Alert ID necklace. He took out his cell phone and called our number. Since we only live a few houses from the school, Mrs. Russell was there in less than 5 minutes. I can't tell you how relieved I felt when I saw her flying around the corner, full speed ahead. It's kind of the same feeling you get when the cavalry charges in to save the day at the end of those old westerns you see sometimes. I mean it. If there had been a bugle playing in the background as she ran, it wouldn't have seemed out of place to me at all. Considering how fast she was running, I thought she might try to fling herself up and over the top of the dumpster. But as soon as Skelly spotted her, she slowed to a walk. And even though I was too far away to hear her voice, I could tell she was talking to him the whole time. And within just a minute or two, he was climbing back out of the dumpster. Mrs. Russell hugged him, then brushed him off, then hugged him some more. After that, she put her arm around Skelly's waist and led him home. That night, Mom made Skelly's favorite dinner, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. In between bites, her eyes would fill up and she'd grab a hold of his hand and tell him how deeply and sincerely sorry she was for what had happened. Because it turned out to be her fault that Skelly had wandered away from the house. She'd actually forgotten to lock the front door deadbolt with her key. As for Skelly, he didn't even remember he'd been in the dumpster. As for me, I could only imagine how proud Ma would have been to know I had seen the whole thing and done nothing to help. I choked down some meatloaf and left the table as soon as I could. I went to bed early that night and tossed and turned for hours, it seemed. By the time I got up the next morning, my mother was already in Skelly's room, getting him ready to take out to breakfast. It was her way of apologizing even more, I think. Skelly has always loved going out for breakfast, and it's one of the few things about him that Alzheimer's hasn't changed. Ma takes him to the House of Pancakes at least once a month. I used to go with him, but lately almost never. So when I asked if I could come this time, Ma looked shocked. "Are you serious?" she asked me. "And to what do my dear father and I owe this very great honor?" I just shrugged her sarcasm off. What was I supposed to say? "Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. Remember yesterday when the janitor found Skelly in the dumpster? Well, see, Ma, I already knew he was there. In fact, a couple of guys I know were getting a big kick out of mocking him. So I'm sure you can understand how awkward it would have been to admit he was my grandfather. But then last night my conscience wouldn't let me sleep that good, so I figured that maybe coming out to eat with him might make me feel less rotten about myself." Yeah, like I'm going to tell her all that. Anyhow, I'm sure Ma knew that something was up. She didn't ask a lot of questions, just said I could come. Luckily, when we got there was no one I knew at the restaurant, so I wasn't that self-conscious about walking to our seats. Also, it helped that we ended up in a booth all the way in the corner where the most anyone could see of me was the back of my head. That's usually the best you can expect when you're eating in public with your family. When the waitress came, Ma ordered Skelly a short stack of pancakes with strawberries and whipped cream on top. Skelly has an unbelievable sweet tooth these days. You should have seen his face when his order finally came. He started grinning ear to ear like this was the best morning of his life. It was one of those moments that can make you smile and break your heart at the same time. I mean, getting that happy over some pancakes. I leaned over the table and cut up his breakfast for him. They look delicious, don't they, Skell? Mine do too, see, I ordered the same thing you did. Skelly put a forkful of food into his mouth and his face lit up all over again. Already he had whipped cream on his chin. I dipped my napkin in my glass of water and wiped it off, same as I always do at home. I had just eaten my last bite of pancake when my mother pointed to Skelly's hands. "Syrup, could you take him to the men's room and wash his hands?" Slowly I raised my eyes from my plate. Excuse me? I mean, what was she thinking? Hadn't I been a good enough grandson already this morning? Did she honestly expect me to walk across a room full of people holding Skelly's sticky hand? Oh, Ma, geez, come on. Right away, my mother stood up and reached for Skelly. Fine, I'll take him to the men's room myself. Come on, Dad. This ought to be interesting. Annoyed, I grabbed his hand away from her. Okay, fine, I'll do it. I waited until he was out of the booth, then pulled him along as fast as I could. Halfway across the room, he slowed down to look at some random guy's French toast. I jerked him away. When we finally got inside the men's room, he waved at a bald man I know he didn't know. Quick as I could, I rinsed and dried his hands with a paper towel. There, you're done, let's go. I opened the door and saw Ma in line at the cash register. Grabbing Skelly's hand again, I headed back across the floor. I was already figuring out my strategy. I'd take him straight to Ma, hand him off at the cash register, and wait for him outside. It might have turned out okay, too. But when I was almost there, I caught a glimpse of two girls I knew standing in the waiting area. Felicia Dunn and Leah Falcone, two cheerleaders from my school. I dropped Skelly's hand like a hot potato and lowered my head. Jake! Hey, Jake, is that you? Called Felicia. I picked up the pace. No, I blurted over my shoulder. I mean, yeah, it's me, but I gotta go, okay? See you later. Without ever looking up, I waved goodbye over my head. As I did, I accidentally tripped and fell into the door. I caught myself on the glass and turned to see if the girls had seen me. But instead, I saw Skelly. My heart stopped. He had done a U-turn and was heading back into the dining room. I watched in horror as he stopped at the first table he came to and sat down with a woman he didn't know. He stared at her a second, and then waved his hands and yelled, "Scat!" The woman jumped up. "Manager! Somebody get the manager! This man is a nut!" Ma ran right over. I don't know what happened after that. I was already on my way to the car. I knew the doors would be locked, but I tried them anyway and then took off walking. I crossed the parking lot and waited for the light to change. I was almost 3 blocks away when my mother and Skelly pulled up next to me. She rolled down the passenger window and started yelling. "Excuse me, but did it ever occur to you to tell me you were walking home, Jake? Huh? You think I'm a mind reader? If it hadn't been for those two girls, Skelly and I would still be looking for you at the restaurant." Great. Perfect. Now Felicia and Leah knew my grandfather was the nut. Mom motioned to the back seat with her head. "Come on, get in. We need to get home." "I really just want to walk." I sped up a little. My mother did too. "You're blowing this all out of proportion, Jake. What happened in the restaurant was no big deal, okay? As soon as I explained about the Alzheimer's, the woman understood completely. She even offered Skelly a biscuit and jelly." "Oh, gee, what a sweetheart." I kept walking. My mother's voice got more impatient. "Get in, please. Now. You know I've got to go to work." "But you said you called Mrs. Russell to stay with Skelly." "I did, but..." Just then a horn honked. I looked around. Ma was driving so slow 3 cars were backed up behind her. The guy laid on his horn again. My mother stuck her head out the window and yelled for him to keep his drawers on. That did it. I turned and started running in the opposite direction. I cut through a shopping center and under a fence, and 10 minutes later I was standing in my school parking lot. At the other end, facing me head on, was the dumpster. Stopped to catch my breath, and slowly I walked over to it and looked over the top. Empty paint cans. That's what Skelly had gone in there to get. They'd been repainting the inside of the gym, getting it ready for graduation, and the bottom of the dumpster was filled with empty paint cans and used brushes and rollers and things like that. It's weird that Skelly's still so fascinated by that kind of stuff. But whenever he sees paint cans, his brain makes some sort of weird connection with his past, and he can't quite seem to let it go. I sat down on the asphalt. It was warm on my legs. I closed my eyes and leaned my back against the side of the bin. My mind went back to the restaurant and how completely Ma had misunderstood why I'd taken off. Did she honest to God think that I cared that she'd smooth things over with some shrieky old woman? Did it not even dawn on her that 2 popular cheerleaders from school had watched my grandfather put on a public performance of the nut? "Bud? Hey, Bud, is that you?" The high-pitched voice sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. There's only one person in the universe who has a voice like that. I opened one eye, and sure enough, Mrs. Russell. On nice days, she walks to our house. The school parking lot's like a shortcut. I scrunched myself together and hid my face in my knees. "Oh, no, you don't. Don't you go hiding your head and pretending you don't see me." Ha! Whenever Mrs. Russell says something she thinks is hilarious, she almost always follows it up with that loud ha. Even though it was clear I wanted to be left alone, Mrs. Russell kept walking toward me. I could hear her getting closer. Not her footsteps, her nurse's stockings. You'd be amazed at how far away the human ear can detect the sound of legs swishing together in those heavy white nurses' stockings. Bill Nye the Science Guy should do a show on it. Swish, 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 swish. Finally, I just gave up and raised my head. Uh-huh. I knew it was you, Bud. Yeah, she calls me Bud for some reason. I don't know why. What are you doing down there anyway? What's wrong with you? Except when she talks to Skelly, Mrs. Russell's voice can puncture a truck tire. Nothing, Mrs. Russell. I'm just sitting here by myself, being alone. I stressed the alone part as much as I could, but Mrs. Russell bent over at the waist and leaned closer to me. Are you sure there's nothing wrong? It's not Skelly, is it, Jake? Your mother didn't mention anything was wrong. That's because nothing is wrong. Skelly's fine, Mrs. Russell. She still looked doubtful, though. Really and truly? Yes, really and truly. You could see her relax. Whew, that's good. Then, without any warning at all, she reached out and grabbed my nose. Honk, honk! I should have known it was coming. To Mrs. Russell, honking someone's nose is the height of comedy. She thinks it's a real mood lifter. After she did it, I was afraid she would just keep standing there trying to shoot the breeze. But instead, she stood straight up and looked at her watch. Oh, Lord save us, I told your mother I'd be there by 10:15. If I don't leave now, she'll be late to work. Then, quick as anything, she took off swishing again. She was halfway to the gate when she turned around. Hey, Bud! When you get home, maybe you and me can get your grandpop to take a bath. Across the parking lot, two guys were on their way to ball practice. They cracked up like you wouldn't believe. I just hid my face again. It was kind of becoming a way of life. When I finally went home that morning, Mrs. Russell and Skelly were sitting on the front porch steps. Skelly was eating a fudgesicle. In the summertime, he almost always has a fudgesicle in the morning. My grandfather loves chocolate even more than pancakes with whipped cream and strawberries. As soon as he saw me, he stopped licking his ice cream and smiled. Claude Harper, he said. It made me laugh the way he said it, like he was just plain happy to see me, no matter who he thought I was. I stopped on the step and ruffled his hair. Catch yourself a fudgesicle, huh, Skel? Man, your sweet tooth is having a blast this morning, isn't it? Mrs. Russell stood up. Could you stay out here with him for a second, Bud? He dropped an ice cream bar in the kitchen and it's melting all over the floor. I told her okay and sat down next to him. A drip of chocolate ice cream fell onto his hand. Whoa, it's starting to melt, Skel. You gotta eat it faster, okay? I picked up the paper towel Mrs. Russell had left and cleaned him up. After I finished, Skelly's eyes drifted away and he stared into space. When he finally looked at me again, his face seemed puzzled. Have you seen my mother? Is my mother coming home today? I put my arm around his shoulder. I don't know, Skel. I haven't seen your mother today, but I don't really think she's coming, though. I paused a second and softened my voice. Today, I think you'll just stay here with me. And this is where we'll stop for part 4. And one thing that I hope you're picking up on is Jake's continuous focus on what other people think about it. When he met Aaron Fryer, his first thought is, ooh, maybe I can become popular because that's what he's obsessed with. When he was at the restaurant, oh my goodness, what if these two girls see me? And really, when you think back to that restaurant scene, what's the worst thing that could have happened? These two cheerleaders from his school see him helping his grandfather that needs some assistance? I tell you what, if anyone makes fun of someone for something like that, that's not someone whose opinion you should care about anyway. But Jake continues to be worried about what other people think, and he's just not prioritizing his family right now. And we'll see how that plays out as the story goes on. Join us back for part 5, coming soon.